Strangers was published in 1986, and it was Dean Koontz's 51st novel at the time. He has continued to publish books at almost a rate of, if not more, than one book per year over the last 40 years since Strangers came out, it's just absolutely bonkers. Strangers is a fairly long novel at 630 pages hardback. That's approximately 262,000 words. It is a mystery thriller with supernatural elements, although it is primarily a mystery above all else. The mystery is at least what drives the plot. A fun fact about Dean Koontz before we get into the plot and the prose: Dean Koontz is partially responsible for the success of Dan Simmons, and Simmons is my favorite author, so I think that's cool. On to the plot and the prose now. 6 strangers across America, an author, a surgeon, a priest, a thief, a child, and a businessman, all succumb to unexplainable behavior and personality changes. One finds themselves descending into fugue states seemingly at random, and another is overwhelmed by nyctophobia, paralyzed every night when darkness comes. Every one of these men and women is haunted by a terror unique to them, and they search for answers to their mysterious afflictions, only to discover that none of them are truly strangers, and the secret behind their plight is the answer to one of the greatest mysteries in the universe. Now, the book is written in a third-person, limited point of view. A lot of Dean Koontz's books, at least the ones that I have read, have been in third person, and that's not only my favorite point of view to read from. Third person always feels most natural for me to read, so I usually gravitate towards it myself in my own writing. Dean Koontz really did prioritize the pacing. For a novel its size, Strangers never really lingers on too much. The few times that it really did stay with characters or situations that I really wasn't too invested in, he moved it along quickly enough that I never really resented the book for it. I rarely ever was just waiting for a chapter to end so I could get to something else that I liked better. There were moments that happened, but they were far and few between, especially for a book of this size. I do think that it could have benefited from at least one extensive rewrite. There was some stuff that I think that could have been chopped out and redistributed to the other characters. However, we're going to discuss that more in depth a little bit later. One thing about the prose that I note is that he starts each of the chapters at the beginning of the book with the location, where it's going to be set, in Boston, Massachusetts, in Los Angeles, California. We get that heading at the beginning of every single chapter. However, later in the book, we drop the location heading. Now, granted, there is a reason for that. Again, we'll discuss it later. But it did kind of rub me the wrong way. I prefer for a book to be kind of cleaner when it comes to the titling of its chapters, a little more uniform, but that's more of a personal nitpick, and you take that with a grain of salt. The prose itself is far from perfect, right? He's no Shakespeare. I mean, for that fact of the matter, he's no Stephen King either, but he never fails to paint the picture. It's almost always pretty clear what he means, what he tries to get across, even if it does come across in a little bit of a rocky, a little bit of a clunky way occasionally. No matter what, though, there is a kind of a feeling of endearment in his writing. He does care. It doesn't feel like he's just throwing it on the page to just earn a paycheck. For the most part, it does feel like he cares about the words that he puts down. He cares about the story that he's telling, even if it does come across a little bit lumpy sometimes, if you will. There are an equal number of times where I still think that it works and feels proper and good and helps keep me attached to the story and the characters and the plot and so on and so forth. Speaking of characters, let's go ahead and discuss the cast. There are about half dozen main characters in this book, half dozen protagonists, and about twice as many side characters, secondary characters, so on and so forth. It's never particularly difficult to keep track of any of them, though. Koontz is always very good at giving you something specific about each character to be able to hold on to. Almost all of them kind of feel like they have a lot of the same moral framework installed into them. The bad guys and the good guys even have kind of the same idea of what good and bad even really is. Most of Dean Koontz's characters seem to be just morally good characters, or at least he tries to paint them as morally good. Whether or not you agree with Koontz's morality is up to you, of course, but he tries to paint them as the morally good people in the world that they inhabit, at least. Even the bad people, though, Koontz rarely ever writes a bad guy that is bad just because they're just rotten, right? Sometimes there really is just a rotten character. And Koontz doesn't really ever do that. For the most part, his characters, his bad guys, are made bad guys because of the circumstance, because of the environment. And of course, that's a good thing, but there are times when the other tools need to come out of the toolbox. This isn't to say that, of course, that his characters are, the same. They're not, flat or unlikable or anything like that. They are good. I mean, this is Dean Koontz's 51st published work, depending, of course, on how you slice it and look at it. He's got a really messy publication history. You'll rarely be surprised about what the characters value personally, deeply in themselves when you pick up a Dean Koontz book. If you've read one, you have a pretty good idea of what you're going to be getting into. The details and the particulars of, who they are, the life that they've lived, where they have lived their life, that's all going to be up for grabs. So there were 6 main characters, and we're going to go through each of them right quick. Dominic Corvassus is the author. We actually opened the book with him learning about his somnambulism. He is a recently published novelist, and while that does play into the book near the very beginning, it really doesn't actually have much to do with the overall plot. It just is what it is. He really could have had almost any kind of a successful career, and it still would have worked. But, he happens to be a writer, which is what makes me think that Dean Koontz probably just wrote him to have a little self-insert kind of a character. Ginger Weiss is the surgeon. She comes from Boston, and she was maybe my favorite character early in the book, even though I think her situation was a little bit cheesy, right? She's the one that suffers from the fugue states, and it's just random things that will trigger them off. She sees, for instance, a pair of black leather gloves, and it triggers the fight or flight response in her, and she kind of blocks out her memory and starts running, and then, after a couple of minutes comes back. But she has a short fugue state. But I powered through it, and I actually rather enjoyed her character, right? Especially seeing her actually do some of the surgery early in the book. It was kind of nice to actually watch her at work. I do just like badass women in fiction, so right, I am biased here. Ernie Block is the businessman. He owns a hotel in Elko County, Nevada. He is a veteran, and he is a very proud man. He is horribly afraid of the dark now. He's recently developed nyctophobia. He is really ashamed that he has just suddenly developed this fear of the darkness, seemingly nothing to him, right? But he feels really deeply ashamed with it. I feel like Ernie was a little underused. I was a little ambivalent on him at first, but by the end, I had more positive views of him than not, mostly because of the relationship that he has with his wife, right? He treats his wife with some real dignity, real respect, but again, you can kind of expect that of a Dean Koontz character. A lot of times, that's just kind of the way his protagonists are. They're just good people. They're white knights, as my father likes to call them. Brendan Cronin was the priest, and out of the main cast, he was probably my least favorite. It's not that he was poorly written or nothing like that, and actually his situation was maybe the most interesting. I was just least compelled with him personally as a character. His situation was neat. I just really don't care for the whole priest losing their faith thing. We'll discuss him a little bit more in depth later, though. Jack Twist is the thief. Like Ernie, I was a little ambivalent on him at first, just wasn't sure how I felt, but by the end, I did quite like him. It's a little unclear as to why a thief is one of the strangers, one of the main characters here, given just who the other cast is. But it does make sense as you approach the end of the novel, at least enough that it's excusable if you do get past a couple of the tropes, again, that Dean Koontz injects into his books. Marcy Monatella and her mother, Georgia, are the last real set of the main characters there. We don't really ever get to see from Marcy's point of view, if I recall correctly. It's almost always from Georgia's point of view, at least that whole section of the plot. I like Georgia a bit. She's got a very sympathetic backstory. She also has a name that's spelled in a strange way, and I also have a name that is spelled in a strange way, so I always appreciate seeing that kind of stuff in literature. The kid seems to be afflicted by strange, zombie-like trances or something like that. She goes into this states where she just draws hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pictures of the moon just constantly over and over and over again. There are, of course, a whole slew of side characters that we didn't even get to talk about. Falkirk and Parker and Pablo Jackson and, Zebediah Lomack, the guy. Yeah, there's a bunch of people that we didn't get to talk about, and a lot of them are pretty colorful characters. Koontz does make some very memorable side characters in books. So even if the main characters don't do it for you, you will stumble across a number of secondary characters that are fun to play around with. We are now on to the spoiler section of the video, so if you don't want any spoilers, have a good day. Of course, I failed to mention at the beginning of this video that Strangers is not actually a supernatural book, but a science fiction novel. It's aliens, right? You know. Now, I do have to point out that I actually had that spoiled for me walking into the book, so that did change the way that I approached it while I was reading it. I was actively looking for, the tells and the gives and the foreshadowing that, it's going to be aliens, and there really wasn't as much as I was expecting. As a matter of fact, I really didn't catch very much. It did feel like it neatly fit at the end of the book, at least neatly enough. I don't think that a single one of the protagonists actually considered aliens as a possibility for what was happening to them. Now, granted, I might just not remember. Personally, I actually think that we should have made a fun little plot line of Ernie thinking that it's aliens, and then other people being a little hesitant. But it turns out that he's right. I think that would have been just a fun little thing. Like I said, I think Ernie was a little underutilized, and that was one of the ways we could have utilized him a little better. I think that he should have been the one to have pieced together that it was aliens and then call it. And they actually, holy shit, it's aliens. That probably would have been the best way to do it, in my opinion. But anyway, it doesn't even drop on you until about a third of the way that it's a science fiction novel, and then it's about, I want to say 100 pages to the end that it actually says that it's aliens. I wanted to discuss the locations at the beginning of each chapter. There's a heading at the beginning of each chapter. At the beginning of the book, each chapter starts with a heading that gives you the location of where that chapter is going to be, right? Laguna Beach, California, Boston, Massachusetts, Elko County, Nevada. He drops that about halfway through the book, and that just kind of irks me. All of our protagonists have kind of come together and have met at Elko County, so there's not necessarily a need to have that heading anymore. We all know that they're in, the motel. Me personally, if I was editing this book, I would suggest that he actually would have done the opposite and actually kept them and gone hyper-local with them. If they're at specifically the Tranquility Lounge, then, that's the new heading, right? Tranquility Lounge. Instead of having Elko County, they've now zoomed in and had that, right? And then you could also have, on Thunder Hill, or, on, going east on I-80, or whatever the hell you need, right? There's plenty of different headings that you could have gone with, but he dropped them, and it just kind of irks me. Now, that is, again, a nitpick. It goes against my ideas of form and rules and stuff when I write my own books. That's not how I like to have them, and it irks me because Dean Koontz, in several of his books, just kind of likes to go I don't care about the structure I've set up in the first half of the book. We're just going to get weird with the structure in the second half. He always has reasons for it. I just don't agree with them. Brendan Cronin, the priest, his character really should have been cut. Now, it's not that, his character was executed poorly or anything. It was fine. I enjoyed him fine enough, even though I'm not very fond of the whole priest losing his faith plotline. Realistically, though, his character should have been cut because those functions could have served the story better in a tighter way if they were distributed among different characters. His healing power should have actually been given to Ginger instead, right? She's a surgeon, she's wanted her whole life to, actually bring people alive, to extend life, so on and so forth. It would only make sense that she should have been able to be the one with the magic touch, right? Why shouldn't she have been the one to have that? It seems like it thematically would have rung true there. And beyond that, the part where the other priest, Stefan, when he dies and Brendan gets all, freaked out, right? That part should have been changed out with, honestly, Parker should have died, and Dominic should have gone through that emotional distress there. Koontz could have used that emotional distress for Dom to be able to enhance his ability a little bit later when they actually get into Thunder Hill, help him push his newfound psychic abilities and stuff, right? At least that's what I would have suggested. It would have also narratively justified Parker for coming to Nevada. Also, functionally, Parker didn't really ever have any kind of a character arc or anything. Not that many of them had character arcs, genuine, deep character arcs. Killing Parker would have been a real driver for Dom to go through with his character arc fully all the way. At least I think I would have believed it a little more had Parker have died. As sad as it is, you gotta kill your darlings. Another part that should have been cut entirely was Falkirk and all of the different military perspectives that were, I think there was only like 2 of them that were given throughout the book, but it should have been cut anyway. The book just didn't need an antagonist, and that's what Falkirk was. He's introduced like 400 or 450 pages into the book. I mean, we're like 2/3 of the way through the book, we're introduced to Falkirk, and he's our antagonist, but it really feels like he's just kind of shoehorned in my opinion. The book would have worked better without Falkirk and without ever going to the government perspective. It stripped away some of that fear that Koontz had built up in the mysterious shadow government thing by giving it a face and by attaching a nuclear warhead to it. It's just like, that wasn't necessary for the story he was telling. It started as a thriller and then moved into a bit of an odd, whimsical fantasy in the second half of the book. Despite the fact that it is science fiction, it still felt whimsical and fantasy at the second half. The climax of the book really should have just been the discovery that yes, it really was aliens all along, and then we have a short little come down off of that. The nukes were just kind of unnecessary and made the book a little bit longer than it should have been. Despite the fact that I railed on this book fairly hard, there were still a lot of scenes and a lot of things about it that I enjoyed. I really liked the scenes with Zebediah Lomack and the scenes with Pablo Jackson, specifically the scenes where Ginger comes to find Pablo Jackson dead. And there's the guy in there, like, wow, talk about a moment of real good tension. Now, we were talking a lot about the characters being scared, but as an audience member, you never really felt scared. That's why I say that this book is more of a mystery than an actual thriller, is because we don't feel scared. The characters feel scared. We're intrigued as why the characters feel scared, and we get to learn across the way. It's when Ginger finds this guy and actually has a struggle for her life, then I feel, the tension. I feel like, oh boy. So there is quite a lot about it that I did like, but it still really could have used a pretty substantial edit. It's just too long for itself. So anyway, in conclusion, I think that Strangers has quite a number of weaknesses, but it was written by a seasoned novelist who knows how to make something out of the elements that he puts together, right? Even if I don't think they always fit in the right way, and I think some of it is just excess and bloat, it still was a fine novel. Don't make this your introduction to Dean Koontz, though. Familiarize yourself a little with Dean Koontz first, and then get to this book. I think I'm going to rate it today with a C, just a middle-of-the-road C. I was rarely ever bored, and when I was never actively upset with the book. The characters are all likable, despite their sometimes kind of cheesy nature. And although the book is full of cliches, it subverts enough of them in clever enough ways that I feel like it evens out. Now, am I going to reread this book? No, I don't think that I'm going to need to. At the very least, there are many other Koontz books that I'm going to reread first before I re-tackle Strangers. It was a fine read, but I don't feel like I need to revisit it anytime soon, if ever. My name is Damien, by the way, and I'm also an author. I sell original fiction and used media at various markets around southern Arizona. Check my website for a calendar of upcoming shows. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.